Well, good morning. It's good to see you all this morning. Glad we get to continue in this series on the Psalms. Psalm 90. When I was growing up, one of my favorite movie trilogies was the Back to the Future series. When I was young, we had to pop a VHS tape into the VCR and record them off of the TV in order to have them accessible. Some of you are like, those words mean nothing to me. I have no idea. That's what we had to do. But we had access to those movies, and I watched them a whole bunch of times. And if you're not familiar with that series, it follows a teenager and a crazy scientist who creates a time machine out of a fancy sports car. And that's what the whole series is based on. And the movie takes place in 1985, and they go back to 1955 in the first movie, and then they go forward to way in the future, 2015, in the second movie. And then in the third movie, they go all the way back to 1885. Now, I love those movies for a whole bunch of reasons. They're just delightful. But I think it was maybe one of the first times I had imagined time travel and thought about that. And what if time travel was a possibility? Now, I'm not saying that those movies originated interest in time travel. I don't think that's true at all. But since they came out in the 80s, there have been quite a few movies that have dealt with the possibility of not just time travel, but manipulating time and altering time and stopping time or, exceeding time, going forward in time. It's something that people seem to be fascinated with. And I think there's a reason for that if you get to the philosophical level. I think we're fascinated by time travel or by being able to control time because it's one of those things that we just can't control. There is nothing we can do about it. And there's nothing we can do about it, and it's the defining feature of our lives. Time continues on. It's the thing that we cannot get back. You can't alter it. You can't change it. It moves on at the same pace, and there's nothing that you and I can do about that. We are temporal. One author, let me see if I can get this up here. There we go. Said this in a book about time and how to inhabit time. We are mortal, not just because we die, but because we are the sorts of creatures whose very being is lived in time. Being mortal means being temporal. It is the great reality of our lives. And this morning, I know you know this, but let me just reassure you that you are temporal. You are brief. You are a moment. Each person in this room is a fleeting thing. That's your life, and that's my life. Now, I say that, and that's not something to be discouraged about. It's not how the Bible presents the fact that your life is but a moment. I actually think the Bible presents a different picture, that temporality, the way that you are constrained by time and your life is so brief, that is something that you have to learn to embrace. It's something that you have to reckon with and deal with and learn to embrace. Because ultimately, the way you can do that is that we do have a God who is not brief. He is not momentary. He's not temporary. He is eternal. And so to truly live with wisdom, to live according to the grain of the universe, to understand how you should live life and what the universe works like and who God is, you have to grasp His eternality. That has to be something that is deep within you and that you reckon with and that you enjoy. And you have to understand at a core level and not push aside the fact that you and I have an expiration date. The end is coming. And that's what Psalm 90 teaches us this morning, is how to embrace both of those realities and then how to live in light of that. And so here's what we're going to see in Psalm 90. 4 truths to give meaning to your momentary life. And the first one of these is found in verses 1 and 2 in Psalm 90. And it's this great reality that God is an eternal refuge. You and I are defined by the passage of time. It's hard for us to even think about what it would be like to be outside of the bounds of time because our lives come in a succession of moments. That's all we've ever known. But that is not true of God. And this is the one great reality in the universe. He is above and beyond time. We have to know that and understand it. Now, to grasp that, I want you to look at the very first verse in this psalm. Notice, maybe it went right over your head as Zach read it this morning, or maybe you thought, oh, that's odd. But notice who this psalm is written by. It's not a psalm of David. It's a psalm of Moses, a prayer of Moses, the man of God. And he says the man of God there to make sure that you and I understand which Moses this is talking about. If you're tempted to think it's a different one, maybe living in a different time frame, this is the guy that you all know who wrote the first 5 books of the Bible. This is the Moses who led Israel out of Egypt. Now, this is the only psalm in the entire Psalter, 150 psalms, that is attributed to Moses. Notice also, I appreciate Zach drawing your attention to this. Look up above the title of this. This begins book 4 in the Psalter. There are 5 books in the Psalter. And very briefly, you need to understand why this is so significant. The book of Psalms is arranged in 5 books within the whole, within the Psalter. And let me give you the flow of these books just at a very high level, okay? The first 2 books deal with the life of David. The 3rd book deals with the reign of Solomon through the kings and all the way down to the destruction of Jerusalem and the time when the people are sent into exile. You can see this in Psalm 89, which ends the 3rd book. Look at Psalm 89 and verse 38. But now you, speaking to God, have cast off and rejected. You are full of wrath against your anointed. You have renounced the covenant with your servant. That's the covenant with David. It seems like God is not abiding by this covenant anymore. You have defiled his crown in the dust. You have breached all his walls. You have laid his stronghold in ruins. What is that talking about? The destruction of Jerusalem and of the temple. Continue on. All who pass by plunder him. He has become the scorn of his neighbors. You have exalted the right hand of his foes. You have made all his enemies rejoice. You have also turned back the edge of his sword, and you have not made him stand in battle. You have made his splendor to cease and cast his throne to the ground. You have cut short the days of his youth. You have covered him with shame. Now look down to verse 49. Lord, where is your steadfast love of old, which by your faithfulness you swore to David? Remember, O Lord, how your servants are mocked, and how I bear in my heart the insults of all the many nations, with which your enemies mock, O Lord, with which they mock the footsteps of your anointed. Here's the situation at the end of book 3. Jerusalem has been sacked by the Babylonians. The temple has been destroyed, and there's no Davidic king on the throne. And it's at this point that you move over to book 4. And book 4 is a collection of psalms that are meant to help the nation while they are in exile. They're out of the land. They aren't sure of God's love for them. They're separated from their place of worship and from their families. And so these psalms are meant to help them and encourage them while they're in exile. So, why begin this with a psalm or a prayer of Moses? If you go back to the book of Exodus, when Israel sins with the golden calf, what does Moses do for the people? He intercedes for them, and he prays for them, and God relents and turns from his wrath. And so that's why this begins with a prayer of Moses. It's, in some ways, it's like reaching back into American history and publishing a letter written by George Washington that addresses some political issue that's happening right now. It's a way of going back to your beginning and taking an important figure from your beginning and reminding you of where you've been. And here, it's a way of reminding them of Moses' intercession for Israel, of God's faithfulness to them, and then of God's long history of care and concern for them as a nation. And so notice how this psalm begins with a focus on God as Israel's dwelling place. Look at verse 1. Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations. In exile, Israel has no temple, they have no land, they are without a home, but this psalm proclaims to them that they have always had a home. Even if they were in Egypt, if they were in the wilderness wandering, even when they entered into the land, at every point in their history, God himself has been their home. And this psalm proclaims to them that he is still present with them, no matter where they are as a people. It tells them that despite their sin and despite their exile and the judgment that's come upon them, just like God has been with them during every generation, he is still a place of refuge for them. How can God be this way? How can he always be present and a home for them and a place of refuge for them? Look at verse 2. Before the mountains were brought forth, or ever you had formed the earth and the world, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. If anything in our world seems eternal, it's mountains. How can you move mountains? They seem like they're ancient and have always been there, and yet God created them. He formed the highest mountains, and he has created the entire world, and he has been God since before time began, and he will continue to be God long after time ends. God does not experience moment by moment life the way you and I do. There's no before and there's no after. There's only now with God. Everything is present to him all at once. Now, this truth, this reality, is something to base your life on and to trust in. Because, as we'll learn in this psalm, you and I are not like this at all. One author put it like this: infants of a day old are not able to understand the acts of wise and gray heads. Shall we, that are of so short a being and understanding as yesterday, presume to measure the motions of eternity by our scant intellects? Man, we just often don't know. I cannot remember what I had for lunch last Thursday. And how can I presume to guide and direct my own life in moving through this world? How can I presume to set my own moral code and decide what is right and wrong? How can I gather in all of the information that's available out there that comes to bear on every decision that I make and make sense of it and choose the right thing to do? There is no way I can do that. But God can and does. And he has revealed himself as this eternal God to us in Scripture. And I have to come to grips with this reality of who God is and who I am. And that brings us to our second point. Second truth. God is an eternal refuge. We are temporary. Quite temporary. Verses 3 to 11. So the entire point here is to begin by painting God as the eternal, everlasting God who's above time, and then to contrast God with us. God has created us, and we are momentary. We are temporary. Look at verses 3 through 6. You return man to dust and say, Return, O children of man, for 1,000 years in your sight are but as yesterday when it is past, or as a watch in the night. You sweep them away as with a flood. They are like a dream, like grass that is renewed in the morning. In the morning it flourishes and is renewed. In the evening it fades and withers. God returns us to the dust. He knows the day when our lives will end. He knows how much time we have, and He is ultimately responsible for all of that. We have an end point, but God doesn't. Verse 4 makes that quite clear. For 1,000 years in your sight are but as yesterday when it is past, or as a watch in the night. And then in verses 5 and 6, Moses uses 3 illustrations here to help us understand just how momentary and temporary we are. He describes us as a flood that is swept away, a dream that is past, and as grass that comes up in the morning and looks good and like it is vigorous, and then by evening it is fading from the heat of the sun. In other words, he's presenting our lives as the equivalent of one day of time. We start out in the morning, and by evening we are gone. In the morning, we have vigor and strength and excitement at the beginning, and by the end of the day, we are fading fast and withering. The point here is it's so quick. It's like a flood that washes away a bridge. It's gone. There's one moment it's there, the flood comes, and the next moment it is no more. And there's nothing you can do to get it back. So the question is, why are we temporary like this? That's what Moses answers in verses 7 through 9. Look there. For we are brought to an end by your anger, by your wrath we are dismayed. You have set our iniquities before you, our secret sins in the light of your presence. For all our days pass away under your wrath. We bring our years to an end like a sigh. Death comes because of sin. And every human being is born under the sentence of death because of sin, because it has been inherited and passed down to us, and we practice it. And so, because of that reality, because of our sin, life will end. Verse 9, for all our days pass away under your wrath. We bring our years to an end like a sigh. Genesis chapter 6 and verse 3, as man's sinfulness is increasing, God actually ties a shortened span of life to his judgment. Then the Lord said, my spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. And so God's judgment means that you and I are temporary. And that's exactly what we find in Psalm 90 and verse 10. Look there. The years of our life are 70, or even by reason of strength 80. That's true, isn't it? I mean, not to alarm you this morning, but it's true. Some do live beyond 80. It's true. But almost nobody reaches 100. And 120 is the maximum that anyone lives during this time period. A couple of years ago, we had the opportunity to get a new mortgage and buy a new house. And when you get that, and on every month's mortgage statement, they give you your payoff date if you dutifully pay everything according to the schedule that they have laid out for you. And our payoff date is 2051. I will be almost 70 years old at that point if I make it. Some of you will not be around at that point. It's a short life, isn't it? And notice in verse 10 what he says. Yet their span or their pride or the best that life has to offer is but toil and trouble. They are soon gone, and we fly away. We blink, and we're not young anymore. And life is filled with tough times. It's difficult. Now, I'm not trying to be morbid this morning at all in some of these comments. I really do want you to understand the picture he's painting in the first 11 verses of this psalm, because you have to get the temporal nature of life and really feel it in your gut and reckon with it before you can get to the rest of the psalm. The brief nature of life, and with the brief nature of life, the sinful situation that has caused that, are not something that we reckon with very often. It's not something our culture deals with or thinks about. We don't wrestle with it. Instead, what we tend to do is we push it off. It's like somewhere in the back of our minds that we know that the end is coming at some point, but we push it off and we don't want to deal with it in day-to-day life. And so it ends up on the margins of our lives. And that's what Moses, I think, is getting at when he asks this rhetorical question in verse 11. Look there. Who considers the power of your anger and your wrath according to the fear of you? Death is real as judgment for sin. And this reality should stare us in the face, but for some reason we don't ponder it. We don't think it through deeply. We don't consider the ramifications of it and the seriousness of it. How many people today are living life as if they are immortal? It's going to go on forever. How many are living life as if they won't stand before God in judgment and give an account for their lives and their sin? How many people live, he says here, without the fear of God? A lot do. And so, Moses has painted this picture of God's eternality, of us being very brief and temporary, 70, 80 years maybe, toil and trouble because of our sin. We will pass away. And you have to understand that. Then, once you begin to wrestle with that, you're now in a position to respond in verses 12 through 17. And here's the fourth truth to give meaning to your momentary life. To recognizing our transience brings wisdom. So, rather than seeing our temporary lives as something depressing and death as something we should push out of our minds, Moses actually says to embrace this reality. To embrace it, to understand the reason for it, to know that this is how it is, and it's not just a stoic response where we accept it, it's actually something that will bring about wisdom in our lives. Look at verse 12. So, teach us to number our days, that we may get a heart of wisdom. So let's start with the goal of this. The goal is to get a heart of wisdom. Where does wisdom begin? Proverbs 1 and verse 7 says that wisdom begins with the fear of God. It's a reverence for God. If you look back up to verse 11, this is what most people are living without. The fear of God, reverence for Him, an understanding of His eternality, of His majesty, of His power and His character, and a right grasp of who I am. Seeing things for how they really are. And so the fear of the Lord brings wisdom. What's wisdom? It's knowing the right thing to do in a given situation. And this is so much of what we need in our lives, because situations don't always match perfectly some rule or some command that you have. You have to apply principles and you have to think them through, and you have to consider wisdom when you're making a decision. Wisdom is the ability to take the knowledge that you have and use it toward good ends. And so what brings about wisdom in verse 12? Look there again. So teach us to number our days, that we may get a heart of wisdom. The ability to number your days, to live in light of verses 1 through 11. This looks back to verse 10. The years of our life are 70, or even by reason of strength, 80. Now, of course, it's not just saying that you estimate what year you're going to die in. It's not what he's talking about when he says to number your days. To number your days means to evaluate them, to understand what you need to do with the time that you have left on this earth. One author said that to number your days is to be able to deal with the brief nature of life, to look it full in the face and be able to deal with it. It's to live with death in mind, to recognize your mortality. In other words, it's to live in light of the end. I have a book called Living Life Backwards, and that's exactly what this is describing. It's you start at the end. You start at the reality that you're going to pass off of this earth, and then you live backwards from that reality. Teach us to number our days. That's what he's saying. And that book, Living Life Backwards, is about the book of Ecclesiastes. Now, Ecclesiastes has been largely, I think, misunderstood over the years. People often think of this book in the Bible as painting a very bleak picture of life under the sun. And they say things like, well, describing life under the sun is describing life in a sinful world, and most of it is vain and is worthless. But that's not what Ecclesiastes is doing. That's a misinterpretation of that word vain. I'll get to that in a minute. What's really happening in Ecclesiastes is very similar to what's happening in Psalm 90. The author of Ecclesiastes is wrestling with the reality of death. And he's wrestling with the confusing nature of life. But throughout the book, he actually positively exhorts us in how to live in light of the end that's coming. Several times, he tells us, because your life is fleeting, because it's temporary, live in this way. Live with wisdom. The same thing Psalm 90 is saying. So that word vanity or vain in the book of Ecclesiastes doesn't mean worthless. It actually means temporary. It gives us the idea of a breath, your breath going up in the morning, the same picture that James paints, a vapor. That's what the author of Ecclesiastes is saying about your life is, look, it's temporary, so understand how the world works. Recognize the short time you've been given and live in line with that. Here's a couple of exhortations in Ecclesiastes. What gain has the worker from his toil? I've seen the business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. He has made everything beautiful in its time, even if it's temporary. Also, he has put eternity into man's heart, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. I perceive that there is nothing better for them than to be joyful and to do good as long as they live. Also, that everyone should eat and drink and take pleasure in all his toil. This is God's gift to man. Recognize how temporary your life is and enjoy the good gifts of God that he has given to you. That's the point of Ecclesiastes. Another one. Go, eat your bread with joy and drink your wine with a merry heart, for God has already approved what you do. Let your garments be always white. Let not oil be lacking on your head. Enjoy life with the wife whom you love, all the days of your temporary life that he has given you under the sun, because that is your portion in life and in your toil at which you toil under the sun. Whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all your might. For there is no work or thought or knowledge or wisdom in Sheol to which you are going. In other words, it's brief. Do everything with all of your energy. Enjoy what God has given to you. And that's what the author of Psalm 90, that's what Moses is saying as well. Deal with your mortality. You're going to pass away from this earth, so enjoy the gifts of God now. Pursue wisdom, which means to live in light of the end. Don't push your death to the margins of your mind. One author said it like this. I love this image. If you are typically modern, your life is like a mansion with a terrifying hole right in the middle of the living room floor. So you paper over the hole with a very busy wallpaper pattern to distract yourself. You find a rhinoceros in the middle of your house. The rhinoceros is wretchedness and death. How in the world can you hide a rhinoceros? Easy. Cover it with 1,000,000 mice, multiple diversions. And that's what we do, isn't it? Like a dog going after a squirrel, we're always distracted by everything other than reckoning with the reality of death and the temporary nature of life. Let that guide you to wisdom. So live in light of the end, live with wisdom, and then he gives us some further instructions in verses 13 to 17. Finding joy in God's gifts gives meaning to temporary life. So, to live with wisdom requires recognizing, let me go back here, to our sinfulness before God. We don't ignore that. Moses has made that clear in verses 7 through 11. We don't often do that. That's part of living with wisdom. Now, in verse 13, he shows us what it looks like to see our sin and to know we have a need for God to be our refuge. Look at verse 13. Return, O Lord, how long? Have pity on your servants. So think back to the purpose of this psalm. It's to encourage the Israelites in exile. And so this is a request for God to return to them and bring them out of judgment and exile. So why am I talking about this now? We saw this same language, return, used in verse 3 of this chapter, talking about God sending humans back to dust for their sin. That's where God pronounces judgment on humans for their sin. So what does Moses do? He picks up the same language here and asks God to return to his people and have pity and mercy on them in their sin. That's what he's asking for in verse 13. It's for God to deal with the problem of sin that has put us in this situation. So for Israel, it's a request to end exile, and ultimately, all human exile from the Garden of Eden will end when we fully enter into God's presence through the work of the Lord Jesus Christ. He solves our problem of sin. He solves the issue of God's wrath for sin and unites us to himself. And that's what he's asking for in verse 13. And then, when that has been dealt with, now the life described in 14 to 17 can take root. Look there. Satisfy us in the morning with your steadfast love, that we may rejoice and be glad all our days. Make us glad for as many days as you have afflicted us, and for as many years as we have seen evil. Let your work be shown to your servants, and your glorious power to their children. Let the favor of the Lord our God be upon us, and establish the work of our hands upon us. Yes, establish the work of our hands. So notice in verses 14 and 15, he asks for joy. So he described our lives in 10 as nothing but toil and trouble. And now he says, look, when we are able to see our sin, when we're able to live with wisdom and understand how temporary our lives are, now, God, we ask that you would bring joy into our lives. Help us to be able to recognize the good things that you've brought our way. It is possible, and I would say it is necessary for you and I as Christians to live with great joy in the midst of this life that is temporary and is often difficult. And I would say actually the only way to truly find joy is to live in line with what this psalm is teaching and find your hope in God. So it probably seems counterintuitive, the whole message of this psalm. But the only way to truly enjoy this life is to recognize it for what it is. To see it for what it is. Know you are temporary. Delight in the gifts God has given. So, we have kids at home. There are these sweet moments with kids. Those of you that have small children, you'll understand this. There are these sweet moments with kids where maybe you're putting them to bed and there's this really great interaction with them. And you just want to take a picture of that moment and just pause time right there and stay in that moment forever. And then when the moment ends, you're sad that the moment has ended and you long to get that back. Can never be recaptured. And that's a right response in some ways, I think. But also, thank God for that moment. As it moves, you move past it and anticipate the next one. Because life comes in a succession of moments, and God gives so many gifts along the way. So look for the next one. Worship him and delight in him for the gift he has given, and then anticipate that more are coming your way. One author, the author that wrote that book, Living Life Backwards, said this: in the created world, you can only truly enjoy what you do not worship. I think that's right. God is the only one worthy of our worship because he's eternal. And he, when we recognize that, will establish the work of our hands and give meaning to everything we do, even if at times it seems like there's not meaning to it. He does this out of his grace and love. Look at verse 17. Let the favor of the Lord our God be upon us and establish the work of our hands upon us. Yes, establish the work of our hands. So delight in and enjoy his favor, his gifts, and the goodness that he has shown to us. Don't let moments of temporary life, gifts of temporary life become objects of worship, but turn the worship that you have for them back to the Lord, and your delight and enjoyment in those gifts will grow. You will truly live a meaningful and a fulfilled temporary life as a gift from God. So, what should you do in response to this sermon? Well, I'm going to give you a list here that I stole from someone. It's in a book called Death by Living. And it's a great read. It's one of my favorite books. And the point is the same point I think the author, Moses, is getting at here. Recognize your temporary life and enjoy the gifts that God has given now. Live to the fullest with wisdom. Die by living. That's the point. And here's what he says. Here's what you should do. Ride a bike. See the Grand Canyon. Go to the theater. Learn to make music. Visit the sick. Care for the dying. Cook a meal. Feed the hungry. Watch a film. Read a book. Laugh with some friends until it makes you cry. Play football. Run a marathon. Snorkel in the ocean. Listen to Mozart. Ring your parents, write a letter, play with your kids, spend your money, learn a language, plant a church, start a school, speak about Christ, travel to somewhere you've never been, adopt a child, give away your fortune and then some, shape someone else's life by laying down your own. Here's the point. God has flooded us in this life with eternal favor and goodness. Recognize it. He's given us Christ. He's given us forgiveness of sin, and then he's continued to pile the benefits on top of that. He's given us the ability to enjoy his gifts in this life, even though it's brief and it's temporary. So enjoy them and return the praise back to him for what he's done and what he's given. Whatever you find to do, do it with all your might. Do it for all the joy and be satisfied in the love of God who has given his gifts to you. Let's pray.